She never imagined that an ordinary afternoon would turn into a moment the world would never forget. One careless act of cruelty, carried out in broad daylight, shattered the illusion of safety she had always clung to. In an instant, her quiet routine became a battleground, exposing a harsh truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. What happened next would challenge power, dignity, and justice in ways no one expected. Stay with this story until the end, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what follows. She woke the next morning to the same quiet rhythm that had shaped her life for years, the soft light slipping through the thin curtains, the familiar sounds of the neighborhood slowly awakening outside. Everything around her carried the calm predictability she trusted. The steady hum of passing cars in the distance, the faint rustle of trees in the early breeze, the distant echo of footsteps from neighbors beginning their day. It was a world she had learned to navigate with care, a space where she tried to keep her head down, stay grounded, and move forward one day at a time. Her life was built on routine, on effort, on resilience learned through experience, and on the belief that as long as she stayed focused, she could carve out a small corner of peace for herself. She carried responsibilities that stretched far beyond her own needs, responsibilities that demanded strength even when she felt tired. Work, family, community, the unspoken expectations placed on her shoulders, all of it shaped the way she walked through each day. She had dreams too, quiet ones she didn't always voice out loud, dreams of stability, of belonging, of living in a world where dignity did not have to be defended at every step. Her days reflected that hope, even when the world around her made it difficult. She moved with patience, with kindness, with a determination that came from years of understanding that life was not always fair, yet still worth fighting through. She knew her neighborhood like the back of her hand, every crack in the pavement, every corner where the shadows lingered at dusk, every sound that marked time passing. It was familiar, almost comforting, and for years it had been a space where she felt she could exist without constantly questioning whether she belonged. Yet beneath that familiarity lived a quiet awareness, a tension shaped by experiences she did not ask for but had been forced to understand. She was used to glances that lingered a little too long, to assumptions made before words were ever spoken, to the way presence alone could be treated as a challenge in spaces she had every right to inhabit. She carried these realities silently, the way so many others had before her, not because she accepted them, but because she had learned survival in a world that did not always see her humanity first. As she stepped outside that day, the sun traced a warm path across the street, casting long shadows that stretched along the familiar sidewalks. The air felt still, calm, unthreatening, the kind of afternoon that should have passed without consequence. She followed the same route she had taken so many times before, her steps steady, her thoughts focused on the small tasks ahead of her. There was nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary was waiting just beyond the stretch of road in front of her. Everything looked the same, and yet, somewhere deep inside, a subtle unease lingered beneath the calm. It was the kind of feeling that didn't arrive all at once, but slowly, quietly, like a shift in temperature you only notice after it has already settled around you. She felt it in the way the air seemed to tighten, in the way the quiet no longer felt peaceful but uncertain. A presence formed somewhere behind her, not loud, not obvious, but deliberate. It wasn't fear at first, only awareness, the sharpened instinct of someone who had been taught by experience to notice when attention became scrutiny. She kept walking, her posture steady, her movements calm, but every sense in her body grew alert. The space that once felt open now felt watched. She had felt this before in different moments, different places, that silent shift where identity became suspicion in the eyes of someone else. It was a familiarity she wished she didn't recognize, one she had never asked to understand, yet had been forced to live with. The weight of history lived inside that feeling, stories passed down, warnings repeated, names remembered. She had been told to stay composed, to remain calm, to never give the world a reason to twist her existence into a threat. And so she kept her breath steady, even as unease wrapped itself around her thoughts. The street around her remained unchanged, but the energy within it transformed. The hum of a passing engine echoed differently. The sound of footsteps behind her no longer blended into the background. They sharpened, controlled, intentional. The world felt narrower with each passing second, as if the space she occupied had been silently claimed by someone else. She did not turn around at first. She did not need to. The shift told her everything she needed to know. Authority had entered the moment, not as protection, but as judgment. Her presence was no longer her own. It had been recast. She had spent her life learning how quickly things could change, how even the most ordinary moments could become dangerous without warning. It was never about what she was doing. It was about who she was in the eyes of those who believed they had the power to define her. And as the presence grew closer, that reality settled deeper into her chest. The calm rhythm of her day fractured, replaced by a quiet dread that spread beneath the surface of her composure. The world kept moving around her, indifferent to what was forming in the space she now felt trapped inside. A car rolled lazily past. A distant voice echoed from a nearby yard. Somewhere, wind moved through the branches of a tree. Nothing stopped, nothing announced what was happening. Yet inside her, every instinct screamed that something was unfolding, something that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with perception. She kept moving forward, but the path no longer belonged to her. Her steps grew careful, controlled, measured, the kind of movements shaped by years of knowing that even stillness could be misinterpreted. She thought of the countless moments people like her had endured. Moments where assumption replaced reality, where bias wrapped itself in authority, where lives were reshaped in seconds because someone else decided they already knew the story. Those memories weren't hers alone, they were collective, shared, woven into the fabric of experience across generations. And now she was standing inside one of those moments. The neighborhood that had once held familiarity now felt sharp and unforgiving, every surface reflecting back the truth she had always known but tried to push aside. Safety had always been conditional. Respect had always been fragile. Dignity could be taken without warning. And yet, even as uncertainty tightened around her, she carried herself with grace, with strength, with the quiet resilience she had built over a lifetime of enduring what should never have been asked of her. She did not know how far this moment would go. She did not know whether it would pass quietly or unravel into something far more damaging. All she knew was that the balance had shifted, that her ordinary day was no longer hers to control, and that something heavy, something unjust, was already beginning to take shape. And as the presence closed in, as the air thickened and the world seemed to hold its breath, one truth lingered in the space between fear and resolve. She was stepping into a moment that would not simply pass, a moment that would change everything that followed, whether she was ready for it or not. The shift from unease to certainty happened so gradually that it almost felt unreal, as if the moment were stretching itself out just to make the tension heavier. The presence behind her no longer lingered, it moved with intention, closing the distance in a way that erased any doubt about what this was becoming. The air felt colder now, sharper, as if every sound carried weight. Her heartbeat steadied not from calm, but from a kind of forced focus, the survival instinct that told her she had entered a space where every action mattered. She did not speed up, she did not slow down. She simply continued forward, aware that the world around her had shifted into something far more dangerous than routine. Her surroundings blurred into background noise while awareness sharpened around a single truth. She was being monitored, evaluated, studied as if her presence alone demanded justification. Her surroundings blurred into background noise while awareness sharpened around a single truth. She was being monitored, evaluated, studied as if her presence alone demanded justification. The sidewalk beneath her feet once felt open. Now it felt like a narrow path she had been forced onto, with no room to step off. She had seen moments like this before, not only in life but in stories, headlines, whispered warnings shared by elders who had lived through different times, and yet somehow the same reality. Those stories were no longer distant. They lived inside the space of each breath she took. That silent closeness behind her wasn't curiosity. It was authority molding itself into scrutiny. It was the subtle but crushing message that power moved freely, while she was expected to remain still, compliant, restrained. The moment wrapped itself around her spirit like a tight band, reminding her how easily dignity could be challenged by someone who believed they had the right to question her existence at all. She felt the pressure of that imbalance pressing against her shoulders, the unspoken command that every movement she made had to be careful, measured, harmless. Her mind didn't race, it analyzed. She had been taught to think this way, not by choice but by necessity. Every step, every gesture, every shift in posture could be interpreted through a lens she had no control over. That knowledge lived inside her body, in the quiet muscle memory formed from years of navigating spaces where respect was never assumed. She did not look back, even as the space between them faded into nothing. She already knew enough. The moment didn't need confirmation, it demanded endurance. The world around her continued as though nothing extraordinary was unfolding. A dog barked in the distance. A window closed somewhere across the street. Life carried on, unaware or unwilling to see what was forming in plain sight. To anyone else it might have looked like nothing, just another day, another presence, another quiet scene. But for her, every second stretched long and heavy, filled with the weight of history pressing into the present. She felt exposed inside an invisible spotlight that turned her into a subject rather than a person. The shift from presence to control came next, subtle, wordless, yet undeniable. Space was claimed, not shared. Boundaries were imposed without being spoken aloud. Power did not announce itself through sound. It announced itself through proximity, posture, intent. She no longer felt like someone walking through her own neighborhood. She felt like someone who had been taken out of time and placed inside a moment where her identity was no longer neutral, but criminalized by assumption. Emotions surged beneath the surface, fear, anger, humiliation, all woven together into something raw and overwhelming. But she held her composure, because composure was the only shield the world had ever allowed her. Even in discomfort, she carried herself with strength, though that strength did not erase the vulnerability of the situation. Beneath the stillness, her spirit trembled beneath the pressure of being reduced to a symbol instead of a human being with a life, a story, a heart. The control deepened. The imbalance grew heavier. She felt less like a person moving freely and more like someone being placed into a silent narrative she had never agreed to be part of. The air itself seemed to turn into a barrier, pushing against her, reminding her that this moment belonged to someone else's authority. She had not done anything. She had not broken any rule. She had simply existed, and somehow that had been deemed unacceptable. Humiliation crept in slowly, not through noise or spectacle, but through the quiet assertion that she did not have the right to move without being evaluated. It was the kind of violation that didn't bruise the skin but left marks on the spirit, marks that lived far longer than the moment itself. The realization sank deeper. This was never about safety. It was about power, who was allowed to carry it, and who was expected to stand beneath it. Inside, her thoughts turned to others, to stories she had heard, to lives reshaped by moments just like this. She remembered faces she had never met, names she could never forget, people whose existence had been treated as a threat long before they had been allowed to speak for themselves. She was not alone in this experience, even if she stood there isolated in her own moment of fear. She was part of something far larger, a chain of injustice woven through generations. And then the situation twisted further, crossing from quiet control into open humiliation. The balance didn't just tilt, it collapsed entirely, turning the moment into a spectacle of power where she was no longer just judged, but diminished. The injustice sharpened, becoming something you could feel in the air, something impossible to deny even if the world chose to look away. Her dignity, her humanity, her sense of safety, all of it was placed on the edge of something fragile and irrevocable. Her pulse thundered beneath her skin, the adrenaline mixing with disbelief at how quickly this ordinary day had transformed into something brutal and demeaning. Every instinct inside her fought the urge to collapse into fear, to retreat inward where the world could not reach her. But she refused to vanish, even as vulnerability wrapped around her like a tightening rope. She stood in the storm of the moment, feeling every insult, every injustice, every unsaid message that echoed through what was happening. The world around her narrowed into a tunnel of sensation and memory, where the past and present blurred into one long continuum of inequity. She was aware of the risk, aware of how fragile life could become in moments like this, aware that even the smallest misunderstanding could spiral into tragedy. The thought lingered like a shadow at the edge of consciousness, the knowledge that others had stood in places like this and never walked away from them. And yet, beneath all that fear, something else began to rise, not loud, not explosive, but solid and unwavering. Strength did not come as defiance. It came as refusal, refusal to accept the narrative being forced onto her, refusal to allow the injustice to define her worth, refusal to surrender the truth of who she was beneath the weight of assumption. The more the injustice pressed against her, the clearer her resolve became. The imbalance of power had reached its height, but so had her resilience. She was no longer only enduring the moment. She was witnessing it, understanding it, holding it in place with a clarity that refused to let it disappear into silence. The humiliation intended to diminish her instead revealed the depth of her inner strength, the kind that is built not from comfort, but from a lifetime of carrying dignity through a world that so often tried to deny it. Time hung suspended, stretched thin by the tension that wrapped around everything. The world seemed to pause at the edge of transformation, hovering between the possibility of collapse and the promise of resistance. The injustice had reached a breaking point, and so had her spirit. She felt herself standing at the threshold of something irreversible, something that would shape not only the outcome of this moment, but the meaning of her life beyond it. Her breath steadied not because the fear had disappeared, but because courage had taken its place beside it. She knew that nothing about what was unfolding was fair, nothing about it justified, nothing about it accidental. This was a reflection of something much larger than a single encounter. It was a reflection of a world that had been built on inequity, guarded by power, and enforced through moments just like this. And somewhere within that realization, a profound clarity emerged. She was still standing. She was still present. And no amount of authority, cruelty, or humiliation could erase the truth of her existence. The moment had not defeated her, it had revealed her. What came next was uncertain. What came next could change everything. But one thing was undeniable: the turning point was no longer approaching. It was already here, pressing against the edge of her future, waiting for the next breath to decide how the story would unfold. The moment when everything collided did not arrive with noise or warning. It unfolded in a slow, crushing wave, until the weight of it was undeniable. The fragile balance of the scene shattered, and the quiet humiliation that had followed her like a shadow finally transformed into something harsher, something meant not just to control, but to break her completely. The world around her seemed to tilt out of alignment, and in that distorted instant, she was no longer a woman going about her day. She had been reduced to a symbol in someone else's assertion of power, forced into a role she never chose and never deserved. Shock hit her first, sharp and breathless, the kind that steals the air from the lungs before the mind can grasp what is happening. Every fiber of her body reacted to the cruelty of the moment, to the sudden escalation that crossed the line between authority and degradation. The injustice pressed deep against her spirit, cutting through every layer of composure she had worked so hard to maintain. The humiliation was not just physical, it was emotional, it was historical. It carried echoes of generations who had been treated as less, denied dignity, stripped of humanity under the guise of order and control. Time fractured around her, breaking into fragments that stretched endlessly and collapsed all at once. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the world itself had shifted into unfamiliar territory where safety did not exist. Her mind flooded with memories and warnings, with stories she had grown up hearing, stories of moments just like this, where lives were rewritten in seconds because someone in power believed they could decide whose humanity mattered. Those stories were no longer distant. She was inside one now, feeling every sharp, terrifying edge of it. Fear surged through her, raw and overwhelming, but it did not stand alone. Anger rose beside it, burning deep and steady, refusing to be extinguished even in the face of humiliation. The injustice unfolding around her did not just wound her spirit, it awakened it. Pain collided with resolve, and beneath the trembling uncertainty, a strength she had carried all her life surged to the surface. She had endured struggle before. She had faced doubt, hardship, and bias in a world that demanded she remain silent. But this moment felt different. This moment forced her to confront not just the cruelty of what was being done to her, but the truth of the system that allowed it to happen at all. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended at the edge of collapse. The space around her narrowed into a single point where fear and defiance existed side by side. She could feel the danger stretching across every second. She could feel how thin the line was between survival and tragedy. The realization washed over her with a chilling clarity. This moment had the power to alter everything. It could change the course of her life. It could end it. It could become another story whispered in grief, another name added to a list that should never have existed in the first place. And yet, even as panic pulsed through her, she refused to disappear. Her heart pounded, but her will remained unbroken. Somewhere within the chaos, a quiet voice rose inside her, steady, unwavering, defiant. It reminded her of who she was beyond the shame being forced onto her. It reminded her of her worth, her humanity, her right to exist without being reduced to someone else's fear or prejudice. The cruelty she faced had been designed to strip that away, to force submission, to impose silence. But instead, it awakened something deeper, the unmovable truth that she was more than the injustice placed upon her. The moment stretched onward, heavy and relentless, testing the limits of what her spirit could endure. Every second felt like a blade pressed against the edge of possibility, threatening to cut through the fragile thread that anchored her to safety. But even as vulnerability wrapped itself around her like a tightening net, resilience rose in its shadow. She refused to let this moment erase her. She refused to sink into invisibility. She stood in the storm, trembling but unbroken, carrying the silent strength of every life that had faced injustice before her and refused to surrender. The injustice reached its sharpest point, and the truth of the moment became impossible to deny. This was not about protection. It was not about order. It was about power used without compassion, without accountability, without regard for the human being standing beneath it. The world around her still looked familiar, but nothing about it felt safe anymore. The neighborhood, the pavement, the afternoon air, everything had shifted into a space where cruelty could exist openly, where dignity could be stripped away with chilling ease. Yet within that darkness, a transformation had begun. She realized that while the situation held control over her body, it could not claim her identity. It could not define the truth of who she was. It could not dictate the value of her life. The injustice pressed against her, ruthless and unapologetic, but it failed to extinguish the fire rising in her chest. The humiliation intended to break her had instead awakened a resolve that refused to fade. She understood now this moment was bigger than the fear she felt. It was bigger than the humiliation forced upon her. It was proof of a system built on inequality, a system that demanded to be seen, confronted, named for what it truly was. Her spirit steadied, her courage took root, and in that fragile, breathless instant, she crossed from being simply a victim of the moment to being a witness to its truth. The world seemed to tremble at the edge of transformation. The tension wrapped around everything, stretched tight, ready to snap under the weight of what it contained. She stood at the threshold of a turning point, one that would shape not only the rest of her life, but the meaning and legacy of everything that had led her here. The injustice had reached its most painful height, but so had her strength. The fear did not vanish, but it no longer stood alone. Hope, fragile yet undeniable, took its place beside it. The moment did not end in triumph. It did not dissolve into resolution. It remained suspended in that breath before change, in that space where fate can shift in any direction. And as the world around her hovered between darkness and possibility, one truth echoed through every fiber of her being. What happened next would not only define the outcome of this moment. It would decide whether the injustice she had endured would remain another silent wound in the shadows, or whether it would become the beginning of a story that forced the world to finally face what it had long tried to ignore. When the tension finally loosened its grip, it did not vanish all at once. It faded slowly, like a storm drifting away while leaving the sky bruised and heavy. The moment ended, but its weight remained inside her, lingering in every breath, every thought, every quiet beat of her heart. She walked away from that place not as the same woman who had begun her day, but as someone reshaped by what she had been forced to endure. The world around her looked unchanged, the pavement beneath her feet, the wind moving through the trees, the distant sounds of life continuing as if nothing had happened. Yet everything within her felt different, fragile, and powerful all at once. She carried the memory of the humiliation with her, not because she wanted to, but because it had carved itself into her spirit. The fear, the anger, the helplessness, all of it remained, echoing through small moments long after the encounter had passed. Ordinary spaces no longer felt ordinary. Familiar streets no longer felt safe. Even the quiet of her own thoughts was different now, shaped by the knowledge that dignity could be taken from her in a single instant by someone who believed they had the right to do so. The experience did not fade with time. It stayed, settling into the corners of her life, a reminder of how fragile safety truly was. But alongside the pain, something else began to grow, something steady, unwavering, and impossible to silence. The truth of what she had lived through refused to disappear into the shadows. It demanded acknowledgement. It demanded voice. She realized that what happened to her was not an isolated moment, not a random encounter born from misunderstanding or chance. It was part of a pattern layered into the world around her, a reflection of a deeper injustice that stretched far beyond her own experience. That realization hurt, yet it also gave shape to the strength rising slowly within her. She chose not to hide from what had happened. She carried her story into spaces where silence had once lived, sharing it first with those who loved her, then with others who understood the weight of such moments without needing explanation. Some listened with empathy and sorrow. Others responded with denial or discomfort, unwilling to confront the truth her experience revealed. But the story had already taken root, and once spoken, it could no longer be erased. It became part of a wider chorus of voices, voices from countless lives shaped by the same injustice, the same fear, the same imbalance of power. In hearing her own story out loud, she recognized herself in others, in their memories, in their pain, in their resilience. Her experience was not singular. It was shared. It belonged to a history written not on monuments or in textbooks, but in lived moments and quiet wounds. It belonged to a legacy of strength carried by those who had endured discrimination and refused to disappear beneath it. She felt connected to them, supported by them, strengthened by the knowledge that she was part of something larger, something both painful and powerful. The impact of what happened to her rippled outward. Conversations began where silence once lingered. People who had never questioned the world around them started to see it differently, even if only for a moment. Some wrestled with discomfort. Some opened their hearts. Some turned away. But the truth remained in every mind it touched, planted like a seed that would continue to grow, shaping awareness in ways that could not be undone. Her story became more than a memory. It became a mirror, one that reflected not just her suffering, but the reality of a world still struggling to understand the meaning of equality, justice, and humanity. She did not emerge from the experience healed or untouched. Healing did not arrive as a sudden release or a triumphant victory. It came slowly, gently, in quiet breaths and steady steps forward. Some days the weight felt heavy again. Some days the memory returned with sharp clarity. But each day she continued to move forward, not because the pain had vanished, but because she refused to let it control the rest of her life. Strength did not erase what she had endured, it allowed her to live beyond it. Over time, the moment that once sought to diminish her became something else, a source of resolve, a turning point in how she saw herself and the world around her. She no longer carried the experience as a mark of shame or vulnerability. She carried it as proof of survival, proof of the strength that lives inside those who are forced to endure what should never have happened at all. The injustice had not defined her identity, her resilience had. Yet the story did not end with her alone, because her experience was never just about one person, one incident, one afternoon. It was a reflection of a reality that continues to shape lives across neighborhoods, cities, and generations. A reality that exposes how power can be twisted into cruelty, how dignity can be challenged for no reason beyond the color of one's skin, how racism exists not only in headlines but in ordinary moments that leave lasting scars. Her story stands as a reminder that injustice is not abstract, it is lived, breathed, and survived by real people every day. And in that truth lies a responsibility to listen, to see, to speak, to refuse comfort in silence, to recognize that change does not begin with laws or speeches alone, but with awareness, empathy, and the courage to confront systems that have been allowed to exist for far too long. Her story is one of pain, yes, but it is also one of strength, resistance, and unbreakable humanity. It does not exist to be forgotten. It exists to challenge, to awaken, to remind the world that dignity should never be conditional. She continues forward now, not untouched, not unchanged, but still standing, stronger, wiser, unwilling to shrink beneath the weight of injustice. Her life moves on, shaped not only by the fear she endured, but by the courage she found within it. And as her story lives beyond the moment, it carries a question that lingers in the hearts of those who hear it. How many more lives must bear this burden before we decide that silence is no longer an option, and that justice, equality, and humanity are not promises to be spoken, but truths that must finally be lived?